It had been 21 years since his first victory at Toulon. Over that time, countless battles, whether they be glorious victories or crippling defeats, were fought. In 1814, Napoleon, now an emperor for 10 years, was on a final campaign for France itself. Despite winning several brilliant victories, the coalition inevitably overwhelmed his crumbling empire. On April 11th, Napoleon reluctantly abdicated the throne as Emperor of the French. After reviewing the Imperial Guard one last time, he was sailed to the island of Elba, along with a guard of 400 men. In his absence, Louis XVIII was placed on the throne by May, restoring the Bourbon dynasty. At first, the people of Paris were enthusiastic. The Sixth Coalition formed into the new Congress of Vienna, which dealt with the hard task of redrawing the map of Europe. France's borders were changed to those of January 1st, 1792, and the Allied nations bickered and argued over the balance of power. But over a few months, Napoleon grew tired of playing Emperor of Elba, and sought the opportunity to return to France. With the restoration of the Bourbons, the émigrés, royalists in exile, set foot in France for the first time since the Revolution. Many noblemen were given appointments in the government and military, largely for their status rather than merit. The defeated French populace looked on as their new king and his followers restored the privileges of the nobility. This was especially evident in the military. Young royalists were favored for promotion over experienced soldiers of more humble backgrounds, and popular officers of the First Empire were demoted. Napoleon, ever so watchful, was aware of the seeds of discontent and planned to exploit it. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon announced to the people of Elba his departure. He and 1,000 men, with artillery and carriage, finished boarding a small flotilla of 6 vessels by 8 p.m. and bid farewell. The British patrol tasked with guarding the island later returned from Florence, and the crew were baffled to find that the Little Corporal was nowhere to be found. On March 1st, Napoleon safely disembarked near Antibes. As he confirmed his presence, he immediately planned a march on Grenoble via the Alpine Mountains, avoiding the royalist districts of the south. He was determined to reclaim his place as emperor. Louis XVIII learned of Napoleon's return on March 5th, and as he learned, the rumors and news spread rapidly throughout the continent. Orders for Marshal MacDonald to concentrate with the Dukes of Berry and d'Orléans at Lyon were sent. Marshal Massena was positioned to attack from Marseille to take the ex-emperor's rear. The Bourbons were so keen on capturing Napoleon that another royal decree was issued. Any Frenchman could freely apprehend the former emperor if they wished. Napoleon countered by simply issuing proclamations to the people of his intentions to seize Grenoble and bring the army to his side. As his column approached the final passage, a single battalion of the 5th Line Regiment was dispatched from Grenoble to block Napoleon at La Fère. Faced with the men he once commanded in battle, he said to them, "Soldiers of the 5th, if there is a soldier among you who wishes to kill his emperor, he may do so." With cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" the regiment embraced him. More battalions joined along the way, and he finally entered Grenoble without firing a single shot. Not long after, Lyon fell, as Marshal MacDonald and the Duc d'Orléans fled to Paris. The soldiers garrisoning France received the news, and defected en masse. Marshal Ney, generally disliked by the Bourbons, was summoned in their hour of need. He assembled the remaining loyalist troops at Besançon, promising to bring Napoleon back, quote, in an iron cage. But at Lons-le-Saunier, he would instead join him with his force of 6,000 men. Soon enough, Paris itself became a haven of revolutionary fervor. Louis XVIII promised to stay, but it was nothing more than a half-hearted effort to rally the royalists. In no time, he and the royal family fled to the Low Countries. Napoleon arrived the next day to thunderous applause from a euphoric people. However, he knew that his presence would not be tolerated by the Congress of Vienna, and began restructuring France's government and military at once. News of Napoleon's escape reached Vienna on March 7th. Information was sent to statesmen of all the sovereigns negotiating that evening, and by March 25th, the 7th Coalition was formed under the Treaty of Chaumont. The Allies would raise several armies, expecting to field 700,000 men under the overall command of Field Marshal Schwarzenberg of Austria. However, it would take many months for the armies to mobilize and prepare. A 150,000-strong Prussian army under Field Marshal von Blücher began concentrating on the Lower Rhine. Simultaneously, the accomplished Field Marshal Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, found himself tasked with the formation of an Anglo-Dutch army in the Low Countries. 3 Austrian, 2 Russian, 2 Spanish, 1 Sicilian, and 1 Portuguese army were to take part in the campaign when ready, as well as a contingent from Denmark. Most of these troops would not see combat due to the speed of events. Almost immediately, problems arose for the coalition. Most of Britain's experienced troops were still fighting in America during the War of 1812, so their numbers had to be reinforced with troops from Brunswick, Hanover, and Nassau in British pay. Blücher's Prussians stirred trouble, arguing that all of the Germans should fall under their command instead. But fortunately for Wellington, this was a vain effort. On the other hand, at first, the Dutch and Belgians were apprehensive about the prospect of a military campaign under foreign command in their own country. But this was eased when King William I of the Netherlands pronounced his oldest son William II, the Prince of Orange-Nassau, as commander of the Dutch-Belgian forces. When Wellington arrived in Brussels on April 4th, his command was immediately opposed by the Prince of Orange. Furthermore, he found the British contingent in a wretched condition. The organization of the army into an effective fighting force was going to be Herculean, but Wellington would prove his administrative prowess. He assumed command of the British and Hanoverian contingents, transformed the peacetime soldiers into effective fighting men, secured trusted staff, and inspected the frontier units and fortifications. By the end of April, he already had a plan for the campaign dispatched to his senior officers. The Prussian army was composed of mainly conscripts and inexperienced soldiers, though it maintained its size from the previous war. Internal issues were not so numerous as the ones facing Wellington, but the existing dilemmas were major. For example, the Saxon contingent of the Prussian army had to be removed due to their bitter distaste for service alongside Prussians. As for cooperation between the two armies, the coalition states had a quiet distrust for one another, and were only willing enough to set aside their differences and resolve to defeat Napoleon. On May 3rd, the two army commanders met at Tourlamont to ensure that both armies acted in concert, and to finalize strategy. Still, an air of uncertainty clouded the coalition that month as the armies gathered. Fortunately for Wellington, things would continue to take shape. King William finally approved of Wellington as Commander-in-Chief of the Netherlands armies, ensuring better cooperation between the states. The Allied army was then organized into 3 corps and a reserve. The Prince of Orange commanded the diverse 1st Corps of Netherlands, British and Hanoverian infantry. Lieutenant General Rowland Hill, a veteran of Toulon and the Peninsular War, commanded the 2nd Corps of British and Hanoverian infantry. The Anglo-Hanoverian cavalry and horse artillery were placed under the corps of Henry Paget, Earl of Uxbridge, also a veteran of not only the Peninsula, but York's Flanders campaign. The Duke of Brunswick, son of the man of the same title killed at Jena in 1806, was appointed command of a corps of Brunswick and Nassau troops. Wellington himself commanded the reserve alongside his role as army commander. Altogether, Wellington possessed around 100,000 men and counting. As for the Prussians, the elderly yet aggressive Blücher organized his army as follows. 1st Corps under Generalleutnant von Zieten, a celebrated cavalry commander. 2nd Corps under George Duboslav von Perche I, and 3rd Corps under the command of Johann Adolf von Thielmann. Finally, 4th Corps fell under the command of Friedrich Wilhelm von Bülow, the victor of Grossburen and Dennewitz. All in all, the army of the Lower Rhine climbed to a total of over 150,000 men. As Napoleon unified France and reinstated his government, all attempts at negotiating with the Allies quickly failed. He looked to the scattered army, which numbered less than 60,000 men. To attain the numbers he needed, a total reorganization was necessary, as well as an effort to gain the people's support for war. Napoleon proceeded to finally abolish slavery, then reinstated freedom of worship and the right to petition. Understandably, it would not take long for public support to fall into his hands. As for the army, it was reorganized into 5 corps, 4 reserve cavalry corps, and the Imperial Guard. The new Army of the North was composed of the following: 1st Corps under the Comte d'Erlon, 2nd Corps under the Comte Rey, 3rd Corps under General Van Damme, 4th Corps under Gérard, and 6th Corps under the Comte of Lobau. The 4 corps of reserve cavalry fell under the command of Marshal Grouchy. The Corps of Cavalry possessed some of the finest cavalry commanders of the French army. Finally, the Imperial Guard would be led by Marshal Mortier, a veteran of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars since 1792. The Grand Army's 60,000 personnel skyrocketed to 198,000 by the end of May 1815. With 66,000 more being trained and equipped in the depots across France. To accomplish such an impressive feat, Napoleon had to scrounge up men from the National Guard, police, fortress garrisons, and other branches of civil service and defense. Still, such a number of men could not hope to match the 700,000 men being mobilized against France. Token forces would need to hold out the borders, while the bulk of the army campaigned along the Emperor in a main thrust into the Low Countries. On June 1st, Napoleon held final ceremonies on the Champ de Mai, during which the civil code was restored and new eagles were presented to the army regiments. The coming weeks would see the final, bloody and dramatic clashes of the Napoleonic Wars. In early 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte reclaimed his throne in France with a brilliant campaign for Paris. After this, he introduced extensive political reform and rebuilt the French army from the ground up. He was going to need it, for almost 1 million men would be mobilized to remove him from the country. Again. Wellington's 100,000-strong army of Flanders and Blücher's 150,000-strong Prussian army of the Lower Rhine concentrated in Belgium, while other forces surrounded the French frontier. Napoleon's Army of the North had only 130,000 men to oppose this. Napoleon wasn't entirely alone at first. The flamboyant Joachim Murat, one of his most famed cavalry commanders, brought the Kingdom of Naples against the 7th Coalition. He diverted attention away from France by invading the papacy and Tuscany. However, Murat would defeat the Austrians only once at the Battle of Pianoro. Throughout April and May, the Austrians, under Baron Fremont and Frederick Bianchi, counterattacked and decisively defeated Murat's Neapolitans at the Battle of Talentino. Murat fled to Corsica and then southern France. The war ended before Napoleon's campaign even began. Napoleon understood that to stand any chance against the coalition, he must defeat the two armies in Belgium separately. He would certainly have that opportunity. Wellington and Blücher had no wishes to join in advance until the other armies arrived, allowing the coalition to invade with overwhelming numbers. Napoleon planned to march on Brussels, the regional capital. After taking it, he would decisively defeat the two armies in detail by putting his forces between them and away from each other. Napoleon, who hid his concentration of forces behind the frontier fortresses, moved his army by columns on June 15th. The left column consisted of 1st and 2nd Corps, his center 3rd and 4th Corps, with the cavalry reserves. The right column was just Lobau's 6th Corps. The right and center would be tasked with capturing Charleroi. Comte Charles Rey's 2nd Corps led the way to capture Gosselies, just north of Charleroi. Along the way, he encountered Prussian pickets at the villages of Thuin and then Marchiennes-au-Pont. The right wing at Philippeville made less steady progress. Difficult terrain made progress slow at first, but eventually 3rd, 6th, and the Reserve Cavalry Corps would reach the bridge over the Sambre toward Charleroi and engage Prussian skirmishers there as Comte Rey did at Thuin. As the Emperor joined his forces at Charleroi, so did Michel Ney, whom Napoleon regarded as the bravest of the brave for his actions in Russia. He gave Ney command of the left wing, wishing to reanimate their progress on Gosselies. It took precious time to dislodge the fortified Prussians, but French troops occupied the town by day's end. Ney ordered the Imperial Guard light cavalry that he took with him to follow the enemy to Fresnes, where they encountered stiff resistance from Nassau infantry and artillery. The Allies were pursued to the crossroads at Quatres, which held the roads to other Allied divisions at Namur and Nivelles, as well as the capital of Brussels. Unable to drive the coalition troops out of the crossroads, Ney consolidated his forces for the night. The Marshal had little knowledge of his emperor's plans when he rode off to Cambrai. So as his men rested, he tried to learn as much as possible about the grand intentions of both sides. Though one thing was clear: keep Wellington away from the Prussians. When the light cavalry returned, he sent word to the Emperor that enemy troops defended the crossroads at the hamlet of Quatres. If Ney could hold it, he would block the Allies from reinforcing Blücher. Rey's 3 divisions, still miles away from Fresnes, would continue the fighting next day. The troops that the French cavalry attacked were part of Bernard of Saxe-Weimar's brigade. After he fought a disciplined withdrawal, other Dutch forces at Charleroi confirmed the presence of the French marching from both directions. Bernard messaged his division commander, Baron Perponcher Sedlnitsky, and informed him of the action. Sedlnitsky then ordered Bernard to hold Quatres and promised him reinforcements. Bernard had no plans to leave either way. Letters from Sedlnitsky were hurriedly dispatched to Baron Constant Rebec, the Prince of Orange's chief of staff, to alert the prince, currently en route to dine with Wellington in Brussels. Rebec also penned the other 2 division commanders of the 1st Corps to assemble their forces near Haines-Saint-Pierre. Rebec tirelessly penned piles of reports of enemy movement to the capital. However, the French offensive was first met with apathy. At the ball, hosted by the Duchess of Richmond, rumors of attacks along the frontier were repeated and spread among civilian attendants. When inquired, military officers did not know enough about the situation to confirm their validity. That is, until Prussian officer Friar von Muffling confirmed that French troops were on the march. The rumors were confirmed, but Wellington, not wishing to spoil the ball, kept an almost calm and oblivious front, despite the danger. But in private, he famously declared, "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God. He has gained 24 hours' march on me." The ball continued until supper, where the full details of a letter from Constant Rebec were finally explained to the Duke. Napoleon had taken Charleroi, just 13 miles from Brussels. Word was spread discreetly to the officers, who bid farewell to their comrades and dance partners. For many, it would be their last night alive. The Prince of Orange returned to Braine-le-Comte and ordered his troops at Nivelles to march. Sedlnitsky arrived with 2 regiments from the 2nd Division before dusk. At 4 a.m., the Allied divisions in and around Brussels marched out, pipes and drums playing. Napoleon spent the night at Charleroi, instructing Marshal Soult to relay orders for the right wing and Imperial Guard to move and attack any enemy moving toward his position. Ney was to concentrate his corps, capture Quatres, and move on Brussels until Napoleon could support him. He further augmented Ney's forces by sending François-Étienne de Kellermann's 3,000 cavalry to Quatres. Believing he had no time to wait on the 1st Corps, Ney ordered an advance on the crossroads, screening their inferior numbers. Wellington had arrived there that morning, affirming that the Dutch should only have to block the way against a smaller French advance. Hearing that Blücher had encountered the main army under Napoleon, he rode off to meet with the elderly general at 10 a.m. The 1st battalions of both the Nassau-Usingen and Orange-Nassau regiments were marching to a new position next to the woods on the right when French cannon fire erupted. It was just before 2 p.m. that the Battle of Quatres began. Campire's 2nd Cavalry Division took the Jaegers by surprise and drove them. The regiment's colonel was killed in the charge. Next, a horde of tirailleurs, light infantry, swarmed in front of Pierrefonds in the Bossu woods. Pierremont's defenders could not stand the onslaught of Jamin's brigade. Sedlnitsky reacted, ordering the newly arrived 7th Militia between the Bossu and Charleroi road, as well as the 5th Militia on the right of Gemiancourt, with the flank companies extended to meet the enemy. The clouds of tirailleurs and the French artillery, now loaded with canister, were given many targets, but the 5th, with only 20 of its 450 soldiers being combat veterans, both gave and received great punishment. When the French unleashed the chasseurs and lancers of Campire's division, the rattled young militiamen barely responded in time. After we had formed square, we noticed that some men from one company or platoon were mixed with those of other companies and wanted to restore proper order. Then Lieutenant Colonel Westenberg told us we did not have to be so precise. Wrote one soldier. The French cavalry attempted to break the militia 4 consecutive times, but none were successful. Eventually, the unending fire from skirmishers and artillery compelled the 5th to fall back. Lieutenant Colonel Jean Westenberg encouraged the men to keep steady, but it was the intervention of Orange himself that reanimated the men. Waving his hat in the air, he called to them and led them forward personally. The 5th was a glimmer of hope on the battlefield, as the Allied artillery was driven back toward Quatres. Prince Bernhard kept his position in the Bossu woods, further reinforced by the 7th Militia and the Nassau-Usingen Regiment. Casualties piled, but the line held firm against the onslaught. French skirmishers, having occupied Gemiancourt, screened the deployment of the rest of the 5th Division, advancing in columns toward Quatres. The advance, led by the 5th Lancers and 6th Chasseurs à Cheval, collided directly with the 5th Militia. This time, disorder prevailed, and they routed. The Prince of Orange himself was nearly captured, but found safety within the 7th Belgian Line Battalion, giving them the Star of the Order of William from his chest. My brave Belgians, take it. You have won it fairly. You have deserved it. The attack of Bachlou's division on Pierremont was so swift that Wellington was nearly captured as his staff returned to the battlefield. At this critical moment, Wellington brought with him the infantry of Thomas Picton's 5th Division. He immediately dispatched a battalion of the 95th Foot, the 95th Rifles, to the north of Pierremont to prevent a breakthrough. The green-jacketed infantry, armed with accurate Baker rifles, did just that. It was around 3 p.m. when Jérôme Bonaparte's 6th Division began arriving on the field, bringing Ney's forces to 24,500 men. Also at the same time, Allied cavalry from Jean-Baptiste von Merlin's Light Cavalry Brigade had arrived. Merlin, trying to stem the tide, hastily charged forward his 6th Dutch Hussars against the 6th Chasseurs à Cheval, but without sufficient time to deploy, they were slaughtered. When the 5th Belgian Light Dragoons met their French opponents, officers on both sides recognized each other. Some of the Allied officers, especially Dutch ones, previously served under Napoleon. "To us, Belgians, to us," pleaded French officers. But the ensuing melee was made, and ended with the same results. The French cavalry counterattacked, overrunning the guns of 2 batteries and sabering the crews, before finally being checked by fire from the 92nd Islanders, directed by Wellington himself. The situation was nonetheless perilous. In just an hour, 2nd Corps had almost overrun the line at several points, and were still advancing in all directions. Ney had received word from Napoleon to defeat the enemy in front and join him to envelop the Prussians, and so hastened his attack. In the Bossu woods, French tirailleurs outflanked Bernhard's brigade, forcing them back a distance. His exhausted Jaegers used up all of their ammunition, so he requested reinforcements. Luckily, after Picton's men were directed into line, the first elements of the Brunswick Corps arrived just in time. Grey and black-clad Brunswickers took position near the woods, while the Duke of Brunswick himself led cavalry near a British battery along the Namur Road, calmly smoking his pipe as bullets and shells flew overhead. With the line reinforced, Picton personally led his division in a counterattack on the French columns, advancing between Gemiancourt and Pierremont. Men from the 5th Militia and 27th Jaegers rallied and joined them on the right. Under the unbearable heat, the men advanced in disorder through the fields. The crops were so tall that they couldn't see the enemy, and when they appeared to the French, they were instantly rattled with musketry. Picton halted, and, dressed in his civilian attire, ordered his men to fire and charge. The 2nd Light Infantry of Housson's brigade was shaken momentarily, but gave a galling fire in return. Piret's cavalry once again charged the enemy, this time on their left flank, But despite horrifying losses, the British formed square and held off the charge. Nonetheless, the French infantry and artillery fire proved devastating. Even Picton was hit by spent cannonball, and despite that, the Welshman refused to leave his troops. It was only with the timely arrival of Captain Andreas Cleve's battery that cannonballs were returned to the French. Along with Retberg's Hanoverian battery, Cleve's gunners checked some of the French guns near Pierremont. As elements of Brunswick's corps continued to trickle in, Soubiere's brigade arrived, consisting of the 1st Light Infantry. Marshal Ney personally led its 3 battalions against the Brunswickers on the Allied right, overpowering them and taking that ground once again. Brunswick's losses were piling up, but they held their ground for a moment until the 3rd Line Regiment came upon them. The Duke, seeing this advance, personally led his Uhlans in a desperate charge. It was, however, checked and thrown back by French musketry. It was then that a cloud of dragoons under Kellerman threatened the 2 battalions now being directed by Brunswick himself, who attempted to withdraw in square formation. It was nigh impossible to execute the maneuvers under threat of cavalry and a fierce cannonade. Here, Brunswick was killed while rallying his men. French artillery continued to do its work. To the east of the high road, the Brunswick Hussars watched anxiously as 4 regiments of cavalry threatened both of their flanks. Trying to charge on their right, the cannonade was more than enough to send them flying to the rear. Seeing this, the French dragoons charged the fleeing enemy, leading them straight into the 92nd Highlanders, who deployed their grenadiers at a right angle to check the charge. The volley, uniform but not deadly, was once again enough to slow the momentum. But the threat was not yet thwarted. The columns of the 3rd Regiment of the Line appeared only 300 paces from the crossroads. Wellington, who had ridden up to Lieutenant Colonel James Cameron, gave the word. "Now, Cameron, is your time. Take care of that road." In moments, Cameron's Highlanders were given a deadly volley, but they pressed on and drove the enemy beyond the crossroads. During the action, Cameron was hit in the groin as his men attacked. The wounding of their respected commander put the Scots in a fury as they drove away the French infantry. It was only because of artillery fire that the Highlanders eventually sought shelter in the Bossu woods. Soon, some officers spotted French lancers threatening their position, but most dismissed them as Belgian cavalry. The Highlanders also saw the cavalry approaching. Their officers believed that they were indeed friendly cavalry, but veterans among the ranks doubted this, and knew that they were Frenchmen of the 6th Lancers. And the officers' doubts were quelled when a German dragoon rode by shouting, "Frenchy! Frenchy!" There was no time to receive the attack in square formation. The Lancers tore the 42nd, especially, to shreds, and everyone fought desperately for himself. Sir Brevet Marcara, the 42nd's commander, had to be carried to the rear, but Lancers quickly rode down his carriers. At the same time, the 5th Lancers closed in on the 44th Regiment of Foot. This time, the British were far better prepared and drove the Lancers away with a smart volley. The remnants of the 5th Division, depleted in manpower and ammunition, completed their withdrawal to the heights. The 3rd Division, under Count Karl von Alten, began arriving on the battlefield after a full day's march, bringing the Allies to about 27,000 men. Most of the troops were deployed in the grass field adjacent to the Bossu woods, excepting the 69th Foot. The Hanoverians, along with the 95th Foot, advanced rapidly toward Pierremont, nearly capturing a French battery. The assault was ferocious, but was eventually checked by the 61st Line Regiment. The repulse had little effect. Their French hold on the center was nonetheless weakened. However, d'Erlon had received a different order from the Emperor: march to Saint-Bref and help defeat the Prussians. Wishing to obey his Emperor, d'Erlon notified Ney that he would listen to the Emperor first. Worse yet, Napoleon, thinking that Quatres was already captured, expected Ney to reinforce him, but that order was delivered shortly after 5 p.m., the same time he penned for the First Corps to come to his aid. It was time for Ney to turn to some of his last reserves: François-Étienne de Kellermann's heavy cavalry. Ney wanted him to launch a determined charge in the crossroads and rout the battered Allied infantry. "My dear General, we must save France. We need an extraordinary effort. Tank your cavalry. Throw yourself into the middle of the English army. Crush it. Trample it underfoot." Kellermann was hesitant, but recognized the desperation of the battle nonetheless. He mounted his horse and joined his 800 cuirassiers in person. During the advance, Kellermann spotted the 69th Foot, for whatever reason, changing from square formation into line. The 11th Cuirassiers charged the 30th and 73rd Regiments of foot. The 30th withstood the attack, but the 73rd Regiment panicked and fled into the Bossu woods when the armored horsemen made their appearance. On the opposite side of the road, the 69th desperately tried to close a new square, but the 8th Cuirassiers infiltrated it, slaughtering many of the soldiers. The regiment's color-bearer, George Annesley, received wounds but kept the flag under him. The king's color-bearer, however, was trampled to death, the flag ripped away by a cuirassier. The cuirassiers had sown terror into the Allied line, continuing their charge into the other regiments, which formed into proper squares. Kellermann redirected his forces to attack the Hanoverian battalions, but a devastating volley threw back his isolated cuirassiers. Kellermann's horse was shot from beneath him, and he fell back to the rear on foot with the survivors. After the charge, the 1st Brigade under Peregrine Maitland, part of Major General George Cooke's 1st Division, arrived with 2 battalions of the 1st Foot Guards. They were directed to attack the enemy in the Bossu woods. Prince Bernard's troops watched as the Foot Guards finally drove the 1st Light Infantry from their vicinity, but also when French artillery once again crashed into British ranks, prompting a withdrawal into the woods once again, though this time they held it. Soon enough, the 2nd Brigade arrived, bringing with them the renowned 3rd Foot Guards and the Coldstream Guards. With the arrival of the 1st Division, Wellington felt that he had a superior enough force to attack his enemy, and so the contest of the center would truly begin. The 2nd and 3rd Brunswick battalions slowly drove back the French, until Ney attacked again with some of his cavalry. The Brunswickers formed a square in just the right amount of time, throwing back any charge. Jamin's brigade, however, stemmed their attack with accurate fire. Picton once again advanced his battered division. Surveying the battlefield, his horse was struck by round shot and collapsed on top of him. He was nearly saved by one of his aides. Picton was trying to survey the movements of Count Piret's cavalry, which were once again preparing for a charge, although they were spent by the day's fighting. Hubert's brigade of chasseurs à cheval launched themselves at the 1st and 28th Foot, now formed into a square where Picton was sheltered. Encouraging his men to hold on, Picton bellowed, "28, remember Egypt," in reference to past service. The conduct of his men must have made him proud, for 2 sharp salvos finally drove the chasseurs away for good. The day was growing old, and as the battle intensified, Wellington received a plea for reinforcements to the Prussians at Sombref, engaged in a battle with the Emperor himself. Feeling that he had the edge over Ney, Wellington ordered a counterattack to drive the enemy and march on Sombref. And so the counterattack began, all along the line. The Allies seized the initiative, slowly pushing back the exhausted and now outnumbered enemy. The last action of the day occurred when the first foot guards poured into the cornfield between the Bossu and the high road. Here, the 1st Light Infantry reformed and delivered a great salvo. Comte Pire observed the encounter and sent his brigade of Lancers, Kellermann's Dragoons, and the Red Lancers of the Imperial Guard to the fray. The horsemen inflicted further severe casualties until the survivors took refuge in the edge of the woods, where the Brunswick avant-garde came to the rescue and dispersed the cavalrymen. This relatively local encounter threatened to stop the advance, but Wellington's forces were too great in number to withstand. Exhaustion on both sides began to tell, and finally, the French discontinued the contest completely and withdrew from Gemiancourt. The Battle of Quatres was over. As Ney's forces retired to Frame, the bulk of the Allied army remained among the no-man's land filled with the dead or wounded. Ney praised the conduct of his soldiers, but held untold anger against the orders that took First Corps away, snatching stalemate from the jaws of victory. Comte d'Erlon would arrive only at 9 p.m., relieving the exhausted Second Corps with 2 of his divisions. On the Allied side, the scale of events that day shocked the public, especially in Brussels, as wounded men wandered its streets. While the French had abandoned the field, casualties on either side were nearly equal. Darkness and exhaustion made marching to Blücher impossible. However, because the French could not take the crossroads, the way to Brussels was blocked, and Napoleon's advance faltered. Wellington planned to join the Prussians the next morning and renew the fighting with his reinforcements. But there was one problem. The battle around Sombref did not end well for the Prussians. A courier, delivering the news to Wellington, was shot by a French patrol. The Duke and his staff were unaware of the situation that befell their allies, one that would soon catch up to them. June 16, 1815. The first major battle of the Waterloo campaign, fought around the vital crossroads of Quatres, ended in stalemate with 8,000 to 10,000 men killed or wounded. That same day, another even bloodier battle would be fought near the new Prussian headquarters at Sombref and Ligny. The French were led by the notorious Emperor himself, while the Prussians counted on the 72-year-old Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, known to his men as Marshal forwards, for his aggression. These two battles would lead to arguably the most decisive confrontation of the whole century. The day before, Napoleon's Army of the North poured into Belgium. Immediately, they began driving back Allied outposts. The left wing, now under Marshal Ney, arrived at Gosselies, just north of Charleroi. The center and right wing converged upon Charleroi southern end. Token Prussian forces fought bitterly, but being hopelessly outnumbered, were forced out of the city. Napoleon had driven a wedge between the two coalition armies while placing his forces just 30 miles from the capital. The Dutch hurried a flurry of reports to Brussels, while the Prussians did the same. Blücher called upon his corps, ordering them to concentrate at Sombref. The order needed time to be carried out. 6,500 men of Prussian First Corps under Generalleutnant von Zieten were immediately available. Zieten, a praised cavalry commander and veteran of numerous battles, had placed his 4 brigades along the border to observe French movements, making him more prepared than the other corps for the invasion. Grouchy's reserve cavalry and elements of the infantry pursued and attacked Zieten at his headquarters in Gilly. The first attack by French cavalry nearly penetrated the Prussian squares, but those riders who did so were taken off their mounts and bayoneted. A second charge proved more successful, but Prussian infantry and dragoons were able to keep Napoleon at bay for the rest of the 15th. Because of First Corps' defiant rearguard, the French army was unable to take Sombref, buying time for the Prussians to concentrate. Napoleon ceased the pursuit accordingly for the next day. In the morning, Allied divisions were alert and marching, or preparing to march, for their new destinations. 3 of Blücher's corps were marching to Sombref. One of them, that being 4th Corps under von Bülow, was too far away to take part. Blücher would have to contend against the French right wing, advancing on Fleurus with an incomplete army. Cooperation with Wellington's Army of Flanders, he thought, would be key to victory. Wellington's forces were preparing to face off the French as well, so he rode off to see Blücher and his chief of staff, August von Gneisenau, outside Sombref around 1 p.m. Wellington agreed on swinging to Blücher's aid once he had defeated his opponent. On this condition, the Prussians would accept battle with Napoleon. The Emperor gave his own orders through Marshal Soult. Ney would drive the enemy from the crossroads at Quatres and proceed to outflank the Prussians in the rear. In the distance, cannon fire was heard at the crossroads from Prussian headquarters. The day's culling had begun. Blücher had chosen suitable ground to defend. A steep bank brook known as the Ligny dominated the terrain with its surrounding villages, hedges, and trees that rested along it. Zieten's First Corps deployed in the front line at the villages around and in Saint-Amand. Behind him deployed von Pirch's Second Corps along the road that stretched west to Nivelles and Quatres, and then east to Namur. Thielmann's Third Corps largely held the left flank. Only Fourth Corps was absent. Altogether, the Prussians had roughly 84,000 men and 216 guns. In the early afternoon, Napoleon's forces surrounded the Prussian positions and deployed as follows. Vandam's Third Corps, directly opposite of Saint-Amand. Giraud's 7th Division detached from 2nd Corps opposite Les Amours. In the center, Giraud's 4th Corps deployed opposite Ligny, with the 14th Infantry Division in cavalry forming to the right. The 2nd and 1st Cavalry Corps followed by deploying on the extreme right. Finally, what deployed in front of Fleurus was the famed Imperial Guard, the best of the best, Napoleon's elite veterans. Napoleon observed his army from the windmill of Naveau, with the 4th Cavalry Corps in reserve behind him. The Little Corporal would start outnumbered in manpower at 66,000 men, but had an advantage in artillery with 232 guns. Unknown to Napoleon, the position had concealed much of the Prussian army. He was expecting to start the fight against a single corps at most, then easily take Sombref. At 3 p.m., Vandamme would commence the first move of the day on Saint-Amand. Le Fol would go first with his 8th Division, He read the Emperor's proclamation to the men, wishing them to show their courage and destroy the enemy. The Prussians will be crushed as they were at Jena. Tirailleurs were deployed ahead of the main columns, provoking a response from Prussian sharpshooters and artillery. The French cannon responded with just as much thunder. Nonetheless, the French pressed on. Vernier's 1st Brigade charged with the bayonet, putting the skirmishers to flight. The Prussian left at Saint-Amand was still holding on. So after Vernier's initial success, the foe sent support in the form of the 2nd Brigade. An overwhelming charge resulted in Saint-Amand being stormed and occupied. Many of the defenders, 2,350 of them, were shot or skewered by bayonet. No quarter was granted by either side. Le Faux deployed Vernier's brigade after this local victory to the northern end of town at the Ligny brook. There they would find lines of Prussian infantry and artillery readying to meet them. In the meantime, a second advance was made at Saint-Amand-la-Haye and Le Meaux by Girard's division. The attack began with the thunderous roar of artillery, followed by the beat of drums and the tramping of the men. The marching infantry became shelled by Prussian guns in turn, but the rankers closed the gaps that tore through their ranks as fast as they were made. The tirailleurs fire and superiority in numbers drove the Prussian skirmishers. A more determined stand was made by the 29th Infantry Regiment inside La Haye. However, this didn't last long, and under immense pressure, the regiment evacuated the hamlet. In the center at Ligny, Girard's attack repeated the actions of his comrades, but the leading 12th Division under Baron Péchu, one of the best in 4th Corps, became bogged down at the wooden bridge. Prussian sharpshooters had been heavily reinforced, and nearly erased the momentum of Péchu's advance. The 30th Line alone would lose 700 men in the fighting. A desperate attack by troops from Rome's brigade finally cleared the way and the streets of any obstacles. As Rome's troops entered the town, Prussian fire kept up and bodies littered the streets. An equally desperate attack threw back part of Rome's men, with severe losses. Napoleon observed the bloody contest from afar and realized he had been wrong about enemy numbers at Ligny. There was no way one corps could provide such strength. However, he now knew that the Prussians had moved their right wing forward from some breadth, leaving their position surprisingly vulnerable to envelopment. At 3:15 p.m., Napoleon gave Soult the fateful instructions to take d'Erlon's 1st Corps from the left wing to the heights of Saint-Amand, where he could turn the Prussian right flank. Young d'Erlon, who had rallied to the Emperor's return at Grenoble, set course for the battle at Ligny. After only an hour of combat, the situation became pressed for the Prussians. Von Zieten saw the critical situation at Ligny. The 2nd West Prussian Infantry spearheaded the charge, pouring across the bridge and onto the other side. At first, they were enfiladed on both flanks, and staggered. The battered 12th Division was reinforced by Le Capitaine's brigade of Vichery's division, along with some artillery, which was horse-drawn into the village. Capitaine's advance quickly became defined by a protracted exchange of deadly salvos. The Capitaine himself was killed leading in the front. French guns were moved up and commenced firing canister shot at close range. Fighting was desperate. Back at the heights of Saint-Amand, the back and forth fighting continued. Le Faux's division had regrouped for an attack beyond the town. However, the time it took for the French to recoup also allowed the Prussians to prepare their second counterattack of the day. General-Major von Steinmetz launched his reserves. The attack was made and managed to force the French back to and through the town. Van Damme, recognizing he had lost his foothold, sent Pierre Berthazin's division to retake the town. Having just taken the town themselves, the Prussians were again overwhelmed and reeled from the streets of Saint-Amand. With the Prussian reserves there spent and the road to Quatres threatened, Blücher had to intervene. The elder Marshal galloped over to the 2nd Brigade, being fresh and the nearest troops available. "Children, do not allow the great nation to rule over you again. Forwards in God's name." He fought by his moniker, and the men answered with a resounding cheer, turning to march against Saint-Amand. Quatres' division opened fire as soon as the Prussians came within range, leaving heaps of bodies before them. However, the Prussians stood firm. They let loose volleys of their own. The oncoming fire sent Piat's infantry brigade into disorder. Quatres rode into the fray to rally them, but his horse was struck, lifting him in the air for him to take several bullets himself. His wounds later proved fatal. The 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, outflanked the French, prompting withdrawal of the 2nd Brigade, under fire, to Les Amours. This was only a partial success, for a countercharge by grenadiers from the 82nd Line Regiment was made. While fighting in the June heat in winter coats to help the officers blend in, the Prussians suffered immense losses. The disguise was ineffective. Their commander, Major von Brachenhausen, had been killed. Hours ago, at 3:30 p.m., the protracted back-and-forth fighting at Saint-Amand and Ligny compelled Napoleon to send for reinforcements. D'Erlon had sent his chief of staff, Baron Delcambre, to inform Marshal Ney of the move. Astonished, as he was running out of reserves at Quatres, Ney immediately had Delcambre back to D'Erlon at 5:30 p.m., imploring him to reconsider which wing to support. Ney felt that he had come close to a breakthrough at Quatres and needed reinforcements. D'Erlon, ever loyal at the moment, would obey the Emperor first and foremost. Seeing the left flank of the forces at Saint-Amand exposed, Vandamme dispatched Herbert's 10th Division to the rescue. Together, the two brigades were enough to stem the tide. Only shortly after, von Pierre I's 2nd Corps troops were sent to the front. These troops consisted of 5th and 7th Brigades, with the reserve cavalry, intending to advance on La Haye. Pierre, due to the undulating terrain, was unable to coordinate such a move quickly enough. His 5th Brigade advanced too far forwards, allowing Herbert's division and the divisional artillery to attack. In a short matter of time, the 5th Brigade was mauled, retreating to Vagnolay, making the other two elements halt before it. Only a detachment of Jaegers saved the village from capture. In the Prussian center, von Kraft's 6th Brigade marched on Ligny, with artillery blasting away from the windmill at Brie. 5 of his battalions attacked the Frenchmen who had crossed the Ligny brook, driving them back into the eastern half of town. For now, the French were unable to force another crossing. It was 6 p.m. The Battle of Ligny had effectively stalemated, and both sides had committed large portions of the reserves. Corps and division commanders requested troops time and again, wishing to decide the outcome. At this time, Vandamme first received reports of a large unidentified column, possibly turning his left flank. Preparing for the worst, Napoleon sent all 8 battalions of the Young Guard to shore up the left flank, plus 3 regiments of the Chasseurs à Pied to the rear and left of 3rd Corps. Meanwhile, on the Prussian side, Blücher pondered the same thing. Who are those men? A messenger, August von Nostitz, confirmed that it was the 1st Corps coming to Napoleon's aid. Remembering the absence of 4th Corps, the situation had become even more precarious. If the battle couldn't be decided quickly, Prussian victory would be a fleeting reality. While Wellington was being hard-pressed at Quatres, A strong offensive from his own reinforcements, it was believed, could turn the tide. At 6:30 on the French side, d'Erlon's vanguard arrived and began deploying to the southwest of Vagnolé. However, a courier had caught up with him and immediately informed him of Ney's desperate situation at Quatres. Forced to make a decision in the heat of two battles, d'Erlon ordered his vanguard to stay in place, while he belatedly marched back toward Ney with the rest of his corps. This indecision would have grave consequences for the rest of the campaign. A half hour later, at 7 p.m., another effort was carried out by the 5th Brigade. The young guard advanced upon Les Amours, driving back the renewed effort by the 5th Brigade. Inspired by their success, the battered infantry of the 7th and the fresh troops of the 4th Divisions, along with cavalry from 1st Corps, advanced on La Haye. Blücher reinforced it with battalions from the 6th and 7th Brigade in response. However, the over-concentration of now 30 battalions and 50 squadrons of horse on the right flank would leave the center at Ligny dangerously exposed. It was a gamble. Napoleon had orchestrated much of this, and continued to do so. To Napoleon, the opportunity was clear for a commitment of the Imperial Guard. The Prussian center would be the victim of this hammer blow. A thunderstorm began booming over the battlefield as a French grand battery banged away, hammering the Prussians sheltering among Ligny. The incoming fire was so hot that Donnersmarck pulled out his entire 4th Brigade to the Bois de Loup, leaving Ligny dangerously undermanned. At 8 p.m., Napoleon accompanied the Imperial Guard to battle, supported by Delort's cuirassiers. Prussian artillerists blasted the ranks open, but the Guard only quickened their step, forcing their way on to the opposite bank. Prussian 3rd, 4th, and 6th Brigades were driven back to the heights of Brie. Just as they saw the French emerge from Ligny, Blücher's staff almost immediately came under fire from the Grand Battery. In a desperate bid to allow the infantry to reform, the Westphalian Landwehr cavalry charged the guardsmen. However, the infantry were already formed into square. Each repeated attack proved fruitless. Now it was time for the unnerved Prussians to form square, as French cuirassiers countercharged. For a moment, the young men held firm in the face of such an onslaught. Then the heavy cavalry of the Guard took their turn and crashed into the Prussian ranks. Finally, the infantry fled further toward Brie. The cavalry regiments of von Röder's division were thrown in for another desperate effort. At the head of the 1st West Prussian Dragoons was Blücher himself. A countercharge by overwhelming numbers of cuirassiers met and mauled 2 of the regiments. As Blücher withdrew, his horse was struck by 2 musket balls, pinning the old marshal to the ground as it fell. Graf von Nostitz dismounted, his horse also having been wounded, and rushed to his aid. Cuirassiers, engulfed in the elan of a charge, unknowingly galloped by the 2 men. Reinforcements from Tresckov's brigade came to the rescue, compelling the cuirassiers to briefly retire. Relatively out of danger, Nostitz and Blücher began the 3-mile trek to true safety. Command of the army of the Lower Rhine fell onto Gneisenau's shoulders. It was clear to him that the battle had been lost, and he ordered a retreat. With defeat certain, Gneisenau ordered the survivors 2 miles north toward Gembloux. As the brigades collected their scattered battalions and left as orderly as was possible, Thielmann's 3rd Corps, engaged largely in skirmishing with their opponents the whole day, made their stand at Sombref against the 14th Division that hurled toward them, holding them just long enough for darkness to veil the retreat. Napoleon's men had carried the day. The wounded groaned. Others cried out for water. The eerie silence of night was replaced with an almost collective, hellish howl of the aftermath. In just one day, 2 major battles had been fought within just 7 miles, or roughly 11 kilometers from each other, and the toll was immense. French casualties amount to anywhere from 8,300 to 12,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Prussian losses are more than doubled. 16,000 killed or wounded, with an additional 8,000 captured or missing, as well as 21 guns, now trophies to the French. The situation is so confused that many thought Blücher had been captured during the battle's climax. The toll for the whole day is roughly 30,000 to 31,600 Allied casualties, compared to 12,700 to 16,800 French. Somewhere around 42,000 to 48,000 lives broken, lost, or captured. The dark of night prevented further pursuit of the battered Prussian army, but the situation remained very dangerous for the coalition. On the other front, Wellington had been unable to force an outcome fast enough at Quatres, and as a result, both armies remained divided. Blücher would make a short recovery, but Gneisenau was nonetheless furious at Wellington, believing the Duke had failed to come to their aid. To him and many in the army, their trust of Wellington was broken. But after a brief discussion with his superior, it was decided that the army would regroup at Wavre, while communication was re-established with the Army of Flanders. Shocked by defeat in their close encounters, the Allies were feverishly preparing for the next day ahead. While the uniting of his opponents was still not out of the question, Napoleon had defeated an enemy that outnumbered him and relied on a strong defensive position. It was a major victory. However, fate had already decided something for him. Such a victory would prove to be his last. June 16th, 1815, was a day of 2 great battles. At Quatres, Marshal Ney ran into Wellington's Dutch forces. The skirmish quickly erupted into a full-blown battle as both sides brought up reinforcements. The Prussians were engaged near Sombref at Ligny. Protracted back-and-forth fighting defined the day. That is, until Napoleon broke through in the Prussian center, provoking a retreat. The day ended with both coalition armies unable to join one another. But, elated with success, Napoleon allowed the Prussians to slip away. Despite protests from Gneisenau, the 74-year-old Blücher made his decision to stay in Belgium, ordering a retreat to Wavre instead of east toward Prussia. Despite horrific losses from the previous day, Prussian morale was steady. While the army of the Lower Rhine began its retreat that morning, Napoleon toured the battlefield, believing the victory was more decisive than it really was. Cavalry patrols were eventually sent out along the Namur Road, where they found enemy stragglers and deserters fleeing to the east. Because of this, Napoleon believed that Blücher was retreating via the Namur Road, and not the one to Wavre. Wellington soon learned of his situation, unsure if he could stave off the French again alone. Fortunately, communication with his ally would be re-established. That rainy morning, Wellington decided that if Blücher stayed, he would too. His 30,000 men and all the wounded were evacuated. Wellington endeavored to bring his army to a place he had taken note of in the previous months, the hamlet of Mont-Saillant, located at the town of Waterloo. They slipped away under the noses of Ney's troops. The 17th, after all, was awarded as a day of rest for the French efforts. For this, Napoleon was furious at Ney, declaring to him, "You have lost France." The Emperor, however, was just as complacent and had failed to provide Ney with further instructions. Had Ney been ordered to renew the attack, he could have slowed or even stopped Wellington's escape. Had the Emperor pursued the defeated Prussians, the rest of the Army of the North could have fallen on the Anglo-Dutch left. Seemingly small decisions like these make history. Finally realizing the precariousness of his opponent's situation, the Emperor marched 68,000 men toward Quatres. 33,000 men under Marshal Grouchy were detached to locate and hold off the remaining Prussians. Upon arrival at the crossroads, French cavalry were immediately thrown against the rear units of the fleeing enemy. The armies got so close at Genappe that French lancers attacked and overran the 7th British Hussars. In turn, they were countercharged by the British Life Guards, part of the elite British Household Brigade. The battle resulted in fairly light casualties, however, as it devolved into one against weather for both sides. A nasty thunderstorm quickly drenched all beneath it. Wellington's army had outmaneuvered Napoleon and made it to Mont-Saint-Jean nearly unscathed. In a few minutes, the road and the plain were nothing more than a swamp, which became ever more impassable because the storm persisted for the rest of the day and the whole night, wrote a frustrated French lieutenant. Wellington himself couldn't recall the same severity of any monsoons he endured while in India. French scouts nearly lost sight of the Allies until they stumbled upon the site of Mont-Saint-Jean. Dawn, 18th of June, 1815. The rain lifted, and the miserable night was over. Today was the first time these two legendary commanders would face each other. Plans were relatively simple. Napoleon, with 68,000 men and 246 guns, must defeat Wellington's 67,000 men and 156 guns before any possible reinforcements arrived from Blucher. Wellington must hold Mont-Saint-Jean until they arrive. The battlefield was small, roughly 3 square miles. The Duke placed the bulk of his infantry behind a ridge opposite the French lines, hoping to shelter them from the renowned French gunnery. The bulk of the Allied cavalry, under Lord Uxbridge, was held further back on the left and center. Napoleon would plan around 3 main farm complexes: Hougomont, La Haie Sainte, and Papelotte. Napoleon hoped to threaten, but not immediately capture them. In doing so, he would bring out Wellington's infantry, smash them with the superior artillery, and launch a devastating infantry attack to follow. Those French guns needed time for the ground to dry. The torrential rainfall left the ground a muddy mess well into the morning. The guns were stuck, and several crucial hours were lost while waiting. To keep the enemy on edge, the French made a grand demonstration against the coalition forces. Drums, fifes, and bugles all sounded as each French regiment formed up for battle in plain view of the coalition. John Dixon, Corporal of the Royal Scots, described this show of martial prowess. I could see the French army drawn up in heavy masses opposite me. They were only a mile from where I stood, but the distance seemed greater, for between us the mist still filled the hollows. It was a splendid show, one that I will never forget. Before the battle could properly commence, Grouchy would receive instructions from Marshal Soult. These instructions were perhaps the most poorly written of the whole campaign. Soult contradicted what Napoleon likely wanted. He told Grouchy not to position himself between Wellington and the Prussians, but instead to launch a singular drive to Wavre, keeping his enemy in his front and not to his right like he was told in the very same orders, and to keep away from the battlefield. The roads of the Lane Valley, resting between the two coalition armies, would remain wide open. At Waterloo, attention first went to Hougoumont. Napoleon reckons that if the farm here is threatened, though not yet captured, Wellington would draw troops out from the cover of the ridge and hold them there at the farm, allowing 1st Corps to attack the ridgeline through the center. Quatres, commanding 2nd Corps, ordered Napoleon's youngest brother, Jérôme, to go first with his massive 6th Division. Reaching the woods through the undergrowths and undulating terrain, the 1st Light Infantry received the fire of 600 Brunswick and Nassau skirmishers, followed by the roar of a few batteries posted on the heights north of Hougoumont. Despite their obstinate resistance, the skirmishers fell back upon the farm, some to the main line. Jérôme, contradicting the orders of his superiors, proceeded to pour more meat into the grinder. Colonel MacDonald of the Coldstream Guards, commanding the defense of the place, was prepared. Men were firing from every building, every wall, and every hedgerow and garden. Fighting was most deadly in the 30 yards or so between the woods and the masonry walls. General Baudouin was killed leading his brigade there. The French, supplied without ladders or cannon, were mown down in droves. Many of the wounded could be heard pleading to the Allies to cease their suffering. MacDonald, pressed, took 2 subdivisions of the Coldstream Guards and 3rd Foot Guards and told them to send the French back into the woods. The sortie began resolutely, but was staggered by close-range fire. Luckily, around this time, Wellington was riding over to the right when the attack started and committed reinforcements. He plucked 4 light companies and 2 more artillery batteries, as well as some Hanoverians. He pointed at Hougoumont and said, "There, my lads, in with you and let me see no more of you." Swiftly, the infantry went on and reinforced the complex. The additional batteries enabled the troops at Hougoumont to resume their counterattack. The guards swept away any exhausted French from the kitchen garden and into the woods at bayonet point. However, the French were bringing up reinforcements, including the 3rd Line Regiment. Enemy numbers proved too much for the guardsmen, and they slowly fell back to the gates, and then into the northern courtyard. At this moment, a moment that would be well remembered in Napoleonic legend, was born. 2nd Lieutenant Legros, a sapper who could only be described as gigantic, gathered some 30 or so men from various commands, and led this vanguard to the main gate. They closely pursued the retreating guardsmen into the complex, hacking away and sowing chaos in the defenders. Confusion reigned among the Allies, and Legros almost succeeded in clearing the courtyard. But a quick-thinking MacDonald rushed to bar the gate behind them. With the French cut off, it was the defenders' turn to show no mercy. With the door barred and every gun turned on them, Legros and his men were cut to pieces. Only a lone drummer boy was spared. Despite horrendous losses, Jérôme defied orders and kept feeding men in. In an ironic twist, he would soon have 9,000 men struggling to tie down about 1,200. Meanwhile, over in the French center, cannon fire intensified. One of the greatest infantry attacks of the Napoleonic Wars was about to commence. While the attack at Hougoumont was underway, at 1 p.m., 54 guns in a grand battery began firing what would amount to 4,000 rounds. Their target, the 15,000 troops stretching out from L'Haisson to Papelotte. At first, it was ineffective against them, as they were lying down behind the sheltering ridge. But the well-trained French gunners eventually found their mark in some of the redcoat ranks. The noise was immense, a cacophony of hellfire. Beilin's Dutch-Belgian brigade suffered the hardest. Through the roar of cannon came a familiar sound to the peninsular veterans among the ridge. The pas de charge. 18,000 French infantry of D'Aulon's fresh corps began marching toward them. The Allied gunners pounded away, but they could not stop the huge blocks of infantry. The 1st Brigade, Kiel's 1st Division, attacked L'Haisson. After a tenacious resistance, they swept aside the riflemen of the King's German Legion and the 95th Foot from the orchard and sandpit. The riflemen placed themselves in the buildings, while the 95th raced for the heights. Both the 54th and 55th Line charged, but were halted as accurate fire littered the ground with their bodies. From the heights, the Hanoverian Lundberg Light Infantry came to help, but were rapidly cut down by French cavalry guarding the flanks of 1st Corps. Meanwhile, the rest of 1st Corps, raked by artillery fire, started to gain the ridge. The Allied skirmish line sent to meet them reeled in panic, and the cannoneers spiked their guns. The French cannon ceased fire. Now the fight turned into a protracted exchange of salvos as the other divisions gained the ridge. Schmitz's brigade rushed on to the wavering troops of Beilin's, which broke for the rear, except for one brave battalion. To plug the gap, Picton's 5th Division was thrown into action for the second time in 3 days. The long columns of redcoats rushed into line and blazed away, stunning the enemy. Both sides were soon engulfed in close fighting. Picton, conspicuous in his civilian attire and who had 2 close calls at Quatres, was shot again. This time, he wasn't so fortunate, and died on the field. The 5th Division, now under command of James Kempt, was already depleted by fighting at Quatres, and couldn't hold on for much longer. Their artillery was silenced, and cuirassiers were preparing to strike their flanks. To their relief, the trampling of hooves could be heard behind them. Sir Henry Paget, Lord Uxbridge, had thrown in Somerset's Household Brigade and Ponsonby's Union Brigade at the most critical time. The redcoats hurried to let them pass, and then watched the horsemen race down the ridge. Donzelot's division on the west side, first struck by the Scots Greys, was the 1st Division to melt away. Thousands had no choice but to surrender. One private, Louis Candler, described the rout. A real carnage followed. Everyone was separated from his comrades and fought for his own life. Sabers and bayonets slashed at the shaking flesh, for we were too closely packed to use our firearms. Countercharge by the 800 cuirassiers tried to save the infantry, but they too would be swept away in a chaotic melee. It was a hard fight, but a rout nonetheless, as many of the cuirassiers were pinned around L'Haisson and slaughtered. The British heavy cavalry were advancing far beyond the line of battle. Back on the ridge, trumpeters sounded the recall, but the 2 brigades were elated with success. De Rootz's division, attacking Papelotte, was charged next. Despite witnessing the complete rout of their brother divisions, they managed to barely stave off the charge. Consequently, Ponsonby's brigade turned south toward the Grand Battery and charged the guns. 15 of them and their crews were silenced, but not disabled. By now, the British cavalrymen had gone too far forward. In moments, the chasseurs à cheval and lancers of Derut's division pounced. Colonel de Camaret of the 4th Lancers encouraged the attack. "En avant, children! We must destroy this rabble!" And on they went. Being on fresh horses, the Lancers had little difficulty getting their retribution. Sir William Ponsonby himself was left for dead. Private Hasker of the Scots Greys was also one of the unfortunate Union men that day, and he leaves future generations a compelling memoir. Before I had well recovered my feet, one of the cuirassiers rode up and began slashing at my head with his sword. I soon fell with my face to the ground. Presently, a man rode by and stabbed at me with a lance. He received 2 more wounds before being robbed. Evading capture, he spent the rest of the day looking for medical treatment. As the cavalry charge in the center was made and then thwarted, another thing caught Napoleon's attention. A large body of troops, in dark uniforms, could be seen marching from the east. Were they French bluecoats or Prussian blackcoats? They were soon revealed to be Prussians of Bülow's 4th Corps, heading straight for Plancenoit. Grouchy, under the impression that they were marching north from Wavre instead of west of it, had actually attacked the Prussian rearguard at Wavre, while Blücher's only fresh corps and the rest of his troops slipped away to Waterloo. Soult dispatched another courier to Grouchy, instructing him to lose not a minute more in heading west to Napoleon. Said courier would arrive too late. The sudden appearance of Prussian 4th Corps put great pressure on the French. Wellington had to be beaten quickly, or they faced 2 armies with 2/3 of their own. Over at Hougoumont, its defenders remained defiant. At this time, 5 more companies of the 3rd Guards had reinforced the garrison, relieving 4 Guards-like companies there. It would be an understatement to call the French frustrated by the defenders' stubbornness. In a desperate move, a battery of howitzers was moved up to the west of Hougoumont. There they began shelling the large haystack, setting it on fire. The flames rapidly fell upon the main house and engulfed it. The barn, housing many wounded, soon caught fire as well, and most wouldn't make it out. A ferocious attack commenced as the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Line Regiment assaulted the estate. Several fusiliers and a lieutenant broke through the door, pouring into the courtyard. A counterattack by Nassau Grenadiers threw them back. The rest of the attack faltered, and a new lull took place. Seizing the opportunity, many injured survivors, prisoners, and deserters began fleeing or moving to the rear. This was accompanied by a retiring movement on the ridgeline of 100 paces, ordered by Wellington to reduce the effectiveness of the French artillery. Ney was informed of the movement as if it was a general retreat. Positioned on the southern ridge, he watched as they went. Ney began gathering any available cavalry to join him. General Delort protested when Ney plucked out one of his brigades, warning Ney not to expend heavy cavalry against infantry posted on superior ground. "Forwards! The salvation of France is at stake," Ney retorted. General Milhaud was reluctant as well, but soon his whole cavalry corps was forming for the attack. With Ney at the head, a tsunami of 5,000 cavalry charged across the valley. Allied artillery fired canister shot at point blank. but such shot had little effect. Those gunners turned and sought shelter in the mass of forming British squares behind them. Wellington had seen Ney's preparations and ordered his battalions into square formation. The cloud of mounts and their riders flew into range, and redcoat volleys tore into it, reducing the massed ranks to mere mobs with every salvo. Time and time again, the cavalry were repelled as they attempted to break the squares. Every wave was reduced to a disorganized rabble, doing little more than racing around the squares, looking for a weak point. Every swerve and turn led to another wall of fiery steel and lead. Ney had led his cavalry into a maze of death. The engaged cavalry divisions were losing heart. Ney called on Kellerman's 11th Cavalry Division to intervene. They advanced up the road to Brussels through the trampled fields, and soon crested the heights. However, seeing that the gun line had been overrun and the infantry threatened, Uxbridge intervened with some of his own cavalry. He committed Dornberg's brigade of German Legion Light Dragoons and Zutland's brigade of Dutch Carabineers for a countercharge. The first waves of French cavalry slowly fell back as the 11th Cavalry Division met with their opponents. Uxbridge's countercharge was crowned with success, as the tide was stemmed. The series of attacks were repeated numerous times, with Ney even ordering the heavy cavalry of the Imperial Guard forward. In a short time, Ney's wrecked cavalry began fleeing to the rear in utmost confusion. But as they cleared out, French artillerymen no longer feared hitting their own men, and hammered away at the densely packed Allied ranks. Horse artillery was brought up and then ripped into the enemy with solid shot at close range. The Anglo-Allied infantry, while taking heavy losses themselves, stood firm for the moment. In 2 hours, as many as 7 to 12 charges would be made. Not one would break a single square formation. This waste, though not over, will be deeply regretted. In other sections of the battlefield, it was becoming a battle of 3 armies. Over the course of the day, Wellington muttered to himself one thing: "Give me Blücher, or give me night." His forces had held on against a great enemy, but were slowly being depleted. He had kept a calm demeanor, but in his mind he had no idea if he could really hold out much longer. Then, at 4:30 p.m., as D'Erlon's survivors reformed, a mass of black-coated infantry, artillery, and cavalry emerged opposite Plancenoit. Blücher's forces had arrived. Before 4 p.m., hussars, followed by 2 large Prussian brigades, emerged from the Bois de Paris. Directly opposing them was a single regiment of infantry, with 2 divisions of cavalry, the 5th and 3rd. When told, Ney hurriedly dispatched Lobo's 6th Corps to meet the enemy. It would take them an hour to arrive. The French 5th and 3rd Cavalry Divisions probed against the reconnaissance party, compelling the hussars to retire. And soon enough, the 19th and 20th Infantry Divisions began forming behind them. There, they would make their stand against an enemy hell-bent on revenge. However, another crisis was developing in Wellington's center. La Haisson, garrisoned by 800 men under Major George Baring, had been a frustrating obstacle during D'Erlon's attack. Soon it was the object of another. Additionally, the farm's defenses had been neglected, and Baring's men were running low on ammunition. 4 companies from the 1st Light and 5th Line battalions of the King's German Legion had been sent to reinforce the garrison, as well as 200 more men from the 1st Nassau-Usingen Regiment. By 6 p.m., however, they were once again short on ammunition. more reinforcements were sent in the form of the rest of the 5th Line Battalion. They had their commander killed, color taken, and the battalion cut to shreds by the 9th Cuirassiers during Ney's cavalry charges. However, the Marshal was finally coming to terms that the cavalry was not enough to break the infantry squares, so he sent for the whole 5th Division and a brigade from 9th Division, wishing to assemble for an attack toward L'Isson and then the ridge. In response, Wellington directed Frederick Adams' brigade to the rear of Hougoumont, while George Duplat's King's German Legion brigade would confront the columns advancing in the valley below. Tirailleur leapt from the ranks and targeted Simfer's battery. In turn, German Legion skirmishers detached from their battalions and poured into the French, pressing them back toward the columns. Simfer's battery then began firing canister shot, decimating the front ranks and forcing a hasty retreat. As the bulk of the French cavalry finally withdrew from the infantry squares, Charlet's brigade finally made inroads at L'Isson. Before they knew it, the garrison had been flung into a fight for survival. In no time, hundreds of the French swarmed inside the farm complex, where intense hand-to-hand fighting broke out. Almost as soon as it had begun, the object of Bering's men was to escape. Despite putting forth all of their bravery, almost half of the garrison was wiped out. Later in his years, Wellington himself claimed responsibility for the neglect of L'Isson. With the farm captured, Napoleon was able to quickly move up horse artillery and pound away at the opposing Allied battalions. At 100 paces away, canister and solid shot soon ripped through their ranks. Count Karl von Ulten, leading the 3rd Division, was wounded by the fire, as was Colin Halkett of the 5th Brigade. When Wellington rode into the storm to encourage his men, his aide-de-camp and quartermaster general both also received severe wounds. The toll was telling. French tirailleurs began gaining the crest as the bombardment covered them. The Prince of Orange tried to throw them off with one of his brigades, but in doing so was wounded himself. Ney had the enemy hanging on, but he needed the reserves to make a breakthrough. But for now, it was an artillery duel that the French were slowly winning. "Hard pounding, gentlemen," said Wellington. "Let's see who pounds the longest." Ney would not get the troops he needed yet, for the Prussian front was growing ever more pressing. At Plancenoit, the 16th Brigade advanced in 3 columns and reached the outskirts of the village. Not wanting his only route of retreat being cut off, Napoleon sent in Duhaim's 4,700-strong Corps of the Young Guard to retake Plancenoit. Duhaim then plunged his guardsmen straight into the streets and alleys. His light infantry doctrine was well suited for recapturing the town. Despite their victory, the center and left column overwhelmingly attacked the southern end, driving the Young Guard from their positions. Duhaim fell mortally wounded in the process. With the southern half of town lost, Napoleon looked to his last reserve, the Guard, and ordered Charles-Antoine Morin to take Plancenoit back. Morin dispatched the 1st Battalion, 2nd Chasseurs of the Guard. This battalion was enough to drive the depleted Prussians out of the village. They also captured numerous artillery pieces which the Prussians had no time to spike. Their attack finally ensured Plancenoit to be in Napoleon's hands, at least for now. Once more, Napoleon committed another unit to Plancenoit, this time the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard. They went in with orders to use only their bayonets, no bullets. With relentless fury, they drove the renewed attack out of the village into the fields east of it. Only the arrival of cavalry from Prussian 2nd Corps dissuaded the guardsmen. Further north, opposite Papelotte, Ziethen's 1st Corps arrived on the battlefield. His corps was engaged in the defense of Charleroi, Gilly, and had suffered heavily at Ligny, bringing just 5,000 men to battle. Wellington sent Friar von Muffling to establish communication with them at Smohain, as he desperately needed these troops to help defend his position. The column received conflicting requests from both high commands, delaying their entry into battle. But soon enough, it was decided that they would attack the French at Papelotte. The Prussian vanguard deployed their Schützen and artillery, then began the relief of the beleaguered Nassau troops under the command of Saxe-Weimar in the northern half of the hamlet. Sometime past 7 p.m., Napoleon heard the news. The situation was turning against him. With the Prussian troops pouring onto the battlefield, and he unable to retreat in the face of two armies, thought it necessary to commit his last reserve, the immortals of the Imperial Guard. As night crept over closer, as smoke billowed from the wreckage of battle, 5,000 men and 8 battalions of the Imperial Guard formed into square for protection against cavalry, and prepared to move in them for the kill. In support of them were remnants of Rey's 2nd Corps. As they rallied to the Guard, fighting resumed at Hougoumont once more. The French were applying pressure everywhere they could. Ziethen's corps was reaching the eastern edge of Wellington's line, but Napoleon, not wishing to waste the Guard's morale, assured them it was Grouchy. Before La Haie-Sainte, the familiar pas de charge sounded. The final phase of the Battle of Waterloo had begun. Wellington had been informed of the impending assault by a French deserter, and frantically pulled in every unit he could find to repel it, for his standing battalions had suffered significantly from the bombardment. Allied artillery fired rapidly and desperately, but couldn't match the Guard artillery nor stop the Guard infantry. The first elements of the chasseurs crept up the slope to the left and onto the crest, where immediately they took fire from the British foot guards. Adams' brigade quickly reinforced the British Guards, and together their fire became unbearable for even the chasseurs. Astonishingly, they stopped their efforts, turned, and ran. However, that wasn't the end of it, as on the right flank of the Imperial Guard, the Grenadiers found much more success. First, they attacked and mauled Kielmansegge's Hanoverian brigade, which had nearly run out of ammunition. The brigade was slowly pushed back in disorder. The neighboring 5th Brigade under Halkett buckled under immense pressure. Their right wing broke, and then the whole of the brigade was thrown into a panic. Kruse's large 1st Nassau-Usingen regiment went forward to plug in the gap, but they too were met with the fury of the Grenadiers and fell back. Here, though, was the high water mark for the French at Waterloo. The Grenadiers were struck with an accurate musket and artillery fire. Ney's horse was struck and Friant was wounded. This fire came from Chachet's 3rd Netherlands Division, which had marched from Merbebraine in answer to Wellington. They surged forward with the utmost enthusiasm. Before the Grenadiers could react, their front ranks became decimated. The Dutch, joined by the British Guards, charged over the crest and went down the slope after them. When they were seen running, the rest of the army began to collapse like never before. With fortunes reversed, Wellington raised his hat and sent what seemed like the whole line forward. Lord Uxbridge's cavalry followed and swept down the slope and cut down countless fleeing Frenchmen. This plague spread all the way down to Plancenoit and La Belle Alliance, where the rest of the army melted away. The few scant batteries fired their last shots before their crews raced for the rear. Though one of those cannonballs had struck Uxbridge, claiming a leg. Behind the grenadiers and chasseurs was the corps of the Old Guard, which desperately clung on in the center. Under General Pierre Cambronne, they fell back in good order, and never broke despite the torrential fire of the Anglo-Dutch infantry. But no matter how bravely they fought, they knew their situation was without hope. The square slowly dissolved from losses as it retreated to La Belle Alliance, where Cambronne finally surrendered. The sun had fallen below the horizon, and the whole war was effectively won. An exhausted Wellington let Blücher's bloodthirsty troops pursue. They chased Napoleon's scattered forces all night to the narrow bridge at Genappe. The bridge couldn't possibly handle thousands of panic-stricken men. Napoleon himself had to ditch his carriage to get across. Grouchy, having won an empty victory at Wavre, was horrified by the news, and began retreating toward the border while he could keep his army intact. Napoleon finally reached Charleroi, where he hoped to rally his army, but the defeat was so complete that there was no hope in doing so. He had his last chance. The carnage of the campaign was high before, and it skyrocketed after the battles of Wavre and Waterloo. French losses were especially catastrophic, at 27,000 men killed or wounded, 1,000 to 2,000 captured, and 220 guns lost. In addition, 15,000 more men either went missing or deserted. The Allies, ultimately victorious, also suffered for their triumph. 4,700 killed, 14,600 wounded, and another 4,700 missing for both Blücher and Wellington's forces. Most of Wellington's losses, it should be noted, were killed or wounded by artillery. Combined with the losses of both sides in the previous days, it totals to somewhere in the realm of 93,000 to 100,000 men killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The coalition armies raced south into France. Despite some successful rearguard actions, nothing could stem the Allied tide. From the east, the Austrians were pouring into the frontier. The Russians were not far behind. The Prussians reached Paris, hell-bent on revenge. It took intervention from Wellington to prevent the destruction of the Jena Bridge, which commemorated their crushing defeat in 1806. Napoleon had his last chance and abdicated. Paris surrendered on July 4th. During an effort to flee to the United States, he was intercepted by a British blockade outside of Rochefort. He would spend the next 6 years in exile until his death in 1821. Soon after, the redrawing of Europe began once more. Louis XVIII once again sat upon the French throne. Wellington and Blücher gained a reputation nigh unassailable for their victory over Napoleon. Many of Napoleon's generals, such as Soult, took up positions within the royal government. Others, such as Ney, still regarded as a war hero despite his failures at Waterloo, held out before being captured and executed. Legend says he refused to be blindfolded and ordered the firing squad himself. Waterloo marked a turning point in world history like no other battle. The previous century of on-and-off warfare and rivalry between France and Britain permanently came to an end. In its wake, a new age would come to replace it: the Victorian era.